All right, it is October 10, 2025. Welcome to the Borderlines podcast. I am Steve Murins, and I am joined today, and I'm excited to have Christian Lane, who is a retired CBSA officer. He served in a variety of roles that we'll get in on. But before, and in case I forget, I do want to plug his podcast, which is amazing, the Team 10-8 podcast. I'm not sure, for those who listen to podcasts, what I would necessarily compare it to. Maybe he might, I don't know if he even listens to this podcast, Jocko Willink, in terms of interviewing different people who serve in not public service, but like, what's the word I'm looking for? Police, military,
Sure. Yeah.
ambulance, politicians, enforcement. What would you call it? I
Public
know the
safety,
words on
public
public
safety
safety.
professionals, military professionals. I mean, my show is not nearly of the caliber of Jocko's. I don't have. Sorry, I've got guys delivering stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I've got guys delivering stuff right now. Sorry about that, Stephen. I've
No
given them
problem.
instructions to go around the side. But they've got a great big trailer full of windows and trucks here. And my wife's on a meeting with someone else. So the long story, I wouldn't compare my podcast to Jocko's by any stretch. He's got an amazing following and he does amazing work.
Maybe Andy Stumpf, Cleared Hot. I don't know if you've listened to that one. He's another
No,
special forces based in Montana.
I can't say that I have. But yeah, it's my show focuses primarily on first responder, law enforcement, military personnel, veterans, and you know the policies and politics that impact them, but largely the personal journeys, right? Like the human beings behind the uniform, what it's like for them performing the roles that they perform, and and it was sort of born out of the podcast in a sense, because at that time, there was a lot of, anti-police rhetoric. In fairness, there was a lot of publicity around some really poor police response to incidents like George Floyd, for example. But, coming from my background and knowing the people I know in that industry, I thought it was important to at least provide a platform for others to understand that there's human beings in these roles. And, everyone ultimately is just trying to do the right thing and the best that they possibly can under very difficult and trying circumstances at times. And it kind of took off from there and started to evolve into a show where people were really opening up about some of their struggles with their own mental health and that sort of thing. And it was really cool to watch it evolve. And now it's at a point where I don't have to seek out too many guests. People tend to find their way to the show. So
I troll it looking for guests, which is how we found David Laglands. Maybe I'll repost the episode. He's retired CBSA as well.
Yeah.
And he had said that before agreeing to come on Borderlines, he reached out to you to say, what do you know about this Steve guy? Should I go on his show? And you gave the all clear. So thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem.
Let's get into your history at CBSA. And you had a variety of roles over a 25-year career, some of which I know what they involve, some I'm less clear. So you started as a border services officer.
Yeah.
Which for those like,
so yes and no. When I started, I'm old enough to say that I started as a customs inspector. I started my career. It was then the Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, and we didn't become, or the organization didn't become the CBSA until 2003. So I started in June of 2001 at YVR as a customs inspector, and moved from there to the land border sometime after that. But it was a really interesting time to join a border agency because, as we all know, September 11th, 2001 changed everything. And, I will never forget that day because I'd been on the job literally 3 months, I think. And I was on a day of rest. Uh, I was awoken to the news of America's under attack. I'm like, what? And so I ran out of the bedroom and watching some of the U.S. news that was on TV. My partner at the time had on TV, and so I can't even believe what's happening. My first thought was, okay, well, is Iraq bombing the United States? Like, it was just unfathomable what I was seeing. And so I quickly switched to CBC because I wanted to get a Canadian perspective. And moments after doing that, the news anchor says, that all Canadian or all U.S. airspace has been closed and all inbound flights to the United States have been diverted to Canadian airports. And I went, oh. So I remember phoning the office and I said, hey, like what's going on? And they're like, oh, we don't know yet. Everything's just kind of coming in piecemeal right now. We'll let you know. And so I hung up the phone and grabbed a couple of uniform pieces and figured I'm likely going to have to go in. And, I was literally ironing a uniform shirt and the phone rang again and said, yeah, everybody's coming in. So off we went. And that was my,
to the airport you went?
Yeah, to YVR.
Yeah.
And that was my eye-opening introduction to the crazy world of border security, border enforcement, border protection, border services, and it just kind of went from there. But yeah, I moved from there to the land border. So the people would probably more commonly refer to it as the truck crossing and the Peace Arch, but the Douglas and Pacific Highway ports of entry. And I spent a bunch of years there in uniform, doing some amazing work as well, with some really amazing people. And that's something I don't think, again, it goes back to the human being behind the uniform. I think that's something that the agency does a really, really poor job of promoting is the caliber of people in those roles, and the dedication that they have for their job, for their roles and their functions. I have been very privileged to work with some tremendous officers and support staff in my 24 years, and experience a lot of really amazing things alongside them. And there's really no career like it. I'm not saying the CBSA gets everything right. They don't. But the people who sign up to do that work care an awful lot about the work that they do. And they're there for all the right reasons. And I like to think that I was one of them.
How did you because you then went to inland enforcement, right?
Yeah.
How do you make that leap? I've been asked by a few port of entry officers if I know how they could make the leap. And I've always said, you're asking completely the wrong person. But how did you make that leap?
I just applied. So at the time, so the CBSA was created in 2003, December.
Yeah.
And before then you had Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, and you had CIC, Citizenship and Immigration Canada. And they worked collaboratively at the ports of entry. We used to call them the gray shirts, and we were the blue shirts. And then in 2003, the government merged the two to sort of emulate what the United States was doing with their fusion of immigration, INS and U.S. Customs into the Customs Border Protection. And so we became this one great big happy family. So this was only a few years after that. They had just started, inland enforcement had just started taking in customs inspectors as new inland enforcement officer, immigration enforcement officers. So it was a relatively new phenomenon. And so when I signed on, I'd applied in 2006 sometime, went through a bit of a selection process, and then was offered a position in February 2007. But at the time, I was probably one of 8 or 9, what we called legacy customs people doing this immigration enforcement work. And it was a a learning curve, to be sure. What was probably most challenging about it was with customs enforcement, you are addressing broken laws with tangible evidence. So someone either does or does not have drugs. Someone either does or does not have guns. Someone either does or does not have currency they didn't report, or what have you. Whereas with immigration enforcement, as you well know, Steve, it's more about the person being versus the person doing. So the person is here in Canada and they don't have the requisite documentation, or they're here in Canada and they had something they did in a previous nation that they were convicted for, or they're here in Canada and they didn't meet the test of a refugee, or whatever it is, right? It's effectively targeting and investigating and imposing enforcement actions on people for being versus for doing. And I'm not taking anything away from folks that do have criminal convictions in their home nations, or are fugitives, or are members of, groups that Canada has classified as, terrorist entities and that sort of thing. That's an important public safety role. But ultimately it boils down to, when the CBSA interacts with that person for immigration enforcement purposes, we're interacting with them simply for being, not necessarily doing at that point. If that
you recently had a LinkedIn post about how morally difficult that can be, which was super interesting to read.
Thanks.
Because, did you? And I mean, we could. Well, why don't we actually kind of pause on that now before we get into your other roles?
Sure.
Because I'll just read a part of the piece, which is, quote, "I've listened to a mother plead through tears to delay her removal, a very Canadian euphemism for deportation, so her children could finish the school year. I've explained to a coroner's jury how a woman took her own life in a holding cell rather than board a plane back to her abusive former partner in Mexico. I've told a grown man who lived in Canada almost all his life that he was no longer welcome here simply because his parents never applied for citizenship when they could have. Those moments stay with you. They don't fade with time or retirement. They echo." And David had a similar kind of comment, how that really does stick. And I've witnessed, I could never go into their head, obviously, but I feel like I've witnessed inland enforcement officers struggle with it, because you can tell that they do sympathize with the person who is in front of them, at least some of the time, and that their role is a very difficult one.
Yeah, I think there's more of that than folks would let on, to be honest with you. We're all human beings, right? And we all share, and I wrote this in my essay or my post, but we all share the same planet. We all breathe the same air. We all bleed the same blood. We're all inherently the same as one another. And it's these sort of imaginary lines that are written on maps, and then rules that are drafted on paper to enforce those lines, that immigration enforcement officers and those folks find themselves, responsible for enforcing. And when you're sitting in a room, so the woman crying, that you read in the post there, I'll never forget. That was the very first moment for me, that it started to get hard coming to work and wrapping the flag around myself every day, because this was, we all have mothers. We were all children. We have children. So I'm sitting in this room listening to this woman literally plead and beg for a little more time before we put her on a plane. And she wasn't detained. This was a non-detained removal. And when you're faced with that kind of human to human interaction, but you have to maintain this sort of stoic, stone-faced objective bureaucratic persona, that's hard, and
Mhm.
it starts to wear it. I won't speak for everybody, but I'm willing to bet there are a number of people who, well, I know there are a number of people who've read that post that have messaged me privately and said, "Man, wow, thank you." But for me, it started to wear, and it just, the longer I spent in immigration enforcement work, the more and more difficult it became to come to work and wrap that flag around me and be proud of the work I was doing. That's not to say the laws in Canada aren't there to be complied with and enforced. They are, and until the politicians that we elect change the laws, you're always going to have a need for people like me and like my former colleagues to undertake that work. And as I mentioned before, some of it has a very serious public safety component to it, and it's easier morally to feel justified in taking actions against people who have criminal convictions or who wanted fugitives or members of groups that the government has declared as terrorist groups. That's morally easier to wrap your head around, but it's still a human being
Yep.
and their life that you've ultimately imploded because you're there doing what you're doing and what you're responsible for doing. So it's a very challenging, morally challenging role. And I think that's an area that doesn't get explored very often. And when I look at, what's happening in the United States right now, with the various ICE operations that are taking place, I think one, there's a crisis that's being created amongst undocumented communities in the United States, without question. But I think long term, there's going to ultimately be a surge in mental health crisis for those undertaking those operations, because unless you're checking in with yourself all the way along, and managing the impact to you morally, spiritually, whatever it is for you, in a healthy way, it'll build and build and build and culminate into a crash of some kind. And I
Well, there
think,
especially where like there's masking debates and the risk of people getting doxxed, and it's a very like, yeah, I can't even imagine working in
yeah,
that environment. Do you
yeah,
wish that like, so one of the things that I've commented on is that I think that officers should have more discretion, and that like there was the change in the law in section 48 of the act from if CBSA is aware that someone's inadmissible for whatever reason, they have to remove from as soon as reasonable as practical to as soon as possible. And you had people who don't interact day to day with people who they have to remove, kind of like enforcing this lack of discretion. Misrep has, I mean, this is the one I go on about, is that misrep has to be 5 years. A CBSA officer can't just give a warning or can't say, you know what, we'll do, instead of you're here without status, we'll give you a warning, or it's supposed to be, well, they're inadmissible, a 1-year bar. Do you think the average inland enforcement officer would want more discretion or less? Because I've asked different people in different agencies this idea of giving the individual officer more or less discretion, and I've gotten different answers.
I think that discretion used to exist in a way it no longer exists.
Hmm.
Um, Before the creation of the CBSA, when immigration enforcement work was the exclusive responsibility of Citizenship and Immigration Canada, or whatever, former name it was called, prior to that, I think there was a much larger amount of latitude given to individual decision makers at the officer level than there is now post CBSA. And I think it depends on who you ask, whether or not they
Yeah.
want more latitude or less in their decision making autonomy. Um, I think the CBSA started to change the culture of immigration enforcement. In some ways positive, and in other ways less positive. And that really sort of exacerbated around 2009 and 2010 with the arrival of the migrant vessels Ocean Lady and Sun Sea, and a government at the time that was absolutely adamant that they did not want to promote any further vessels like this in any way, and was issuing directive to the agency to maintain detention, a little less so with the Ocean Lady. I think that one caught everyone by surprise. The Sun Sea was less of a surprise. But issuing directive to continue detention as long as possible, and as a means of deterring. And I think from there it sort of grew its own persona, and the agency from that time onward also became more and more risk averse, and wanted to make sure that the no surprise environment was the norm. We'd hear that all the time, certainly at the management level. No surprise.
No surprise meaning
we want to be able to predict everything. We don't want to be caught. By we, I mean the senior executive of the organization didn't want to be caught with their pants down when being asked by politicians, when being asked by deputy ministers why certain things were happening. And politicians don't want to be caught with their pants down when the public asks them, and so on and so on and so on. So slowly, that fear culture starts to integrate itself into the daily workings of a massive machine, and you end up with I think policies that erode the autonomy that was once available to individual decision makers at the officer level. That's a long way of answering your question, but
no, it makes sense, right? Like the agency, I guess, to summarize it in a sentence, would be the agency was worried about embarrassing the minister. Potentially, because if you get a media story of, I mean, you could see this across anything, right? Like, why was that guy allowed into Canada?
Yep.
Or it's always,
terrified. They're terrified. They're terrified.
Paul Bernardo was transferred to a medium security prison at the bureaucrat level, and the minister is, has to react.
Yep.
And then after that, it will be okay. We want to really be cautious. I can get that.
Yeah.
Were you
sorry, go ahead.
So you became manager immigration detention operations. Was that during the Sun Sea? Was that
no? It was after the Sun Sea. So at the time of the Sun Sea, I was still at the officer level, headlong deep into the investigation of the Sun Sea in specific. But I started in management in 2012, supervising what we called the failed claimant removals unit. So quick history lesson there. Again, the government of the day had provided some earmarked funding for addressing a backlog of removals of people who had not met the convention refugee test. And so the CBSA was given a pile of dollars and told, make this go away. So the agency created units, hired people, border services officers from the front line largely, to specifically focus on these files. And so that's where I started supervising. And that's where I had that conversation with that mother pleading, because she was in for a removal interview with a member of my team. And they'd asked me as a supervisor to come in and speak with her. And, it's immigration enforcement is pretty exciting when you're young. And you're particularly when you're no longer confined to a port of entry. You're not in uniform anymore. You're working in plain clothes. You're going wherever your investigations take you. You're going into homes, you're talking to people in businesses, you're, arresting people out on the street. It can be really exciting work, and it can be really rewarding too. I'm not taking anything away from it, but once I had moved from that frontline investigator, because I'd sort of had my fill, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I was getting a little older, and thought it was time to settle down in my career. And so once I'd made that move into supervising, and then specifically a unit where literally designed and funded to enforce rules against the lowest hanging fruit there is, as far as, immigration violations go. That's where I started to really feel that human impact, and try and find a way to kind of shield myself from it. And then I went from there to immigration detention, managing immigration detentions regionally for the CBSA.
Because when we met, I think you spoke at a CBABC section.
Yeah, and you know what? Honestly, so that was probably the best part of that job. Was getting, honestly, it was getting out and engaging with our stakeholders, as we called it. Getting out and talking to people, meeting people like you, meeting people like your colleagues, meeting representatives of various non-governmental organizations, and working very closely with organizations like the Canadian Red Cross, and because they of course do all the detention monitoring for the agency under an MOU. And I really loved that part of the work. And then operationally, just the comings and goings of the daily hubbub of the logistics of dealing with people in detention. That was fascinating. But it was about 7 weeks into my promotion, and we had the agency's first in custody death in a CBSA facility.
That was a YVR.
Yeah, it was. It was the old what we called the BC Immigration Holding Center in the basement of Vancouver National Airport. A horrible place, by the way, just an absolutely terrible place to house people. And but it's what we had, and things have improved drastically since then, which is fantastic. And I'll say this: whether or not you agree with detaining people for immigration violations, that aside, the way Canada does it versus the way our colleagues in the United States do it, you might think differently were you to see a side-by-side comparison, because the facilities that we would tour, and I'm speaking post death, and I'm going to say her name. Her name was Lucia Vega Jimenez, and that is a human being and a name that is forever etched in my heart. And one of the areas that I have had considerable struggle with, given the responsibility I had for that facility at the time. But in the wake of that tragedy, we did a lot of operational soul searching, trying to figure out what the right model was for immigration detention in Canada and in our region in specific. And part of that process was taking a look at different ways that people, organizations did that sort of work. And I remember going to visit the ICE detention facility in Tacoma, and it's a prison. Period. It is built like a prison. It looks like a prison. Its residents are treated like prisoners. They're housed like prisoners. The staff are de facto correctional officers that get paid a lot more than state correctional officers, by the way. And, when I compare a side-by-side between, what the holding center in Surrey looks like now versus what the holding center in Tacoma looked like then, we're far and away leading in terms of Canada. I mean, as far and away leading in terms of how we house and detain people who are in violation of immigration law in Canada. It's remarkably different. And I think that's something Canadians should be proud of. Again, your personal politics or views on immigration law and immigration detention aside, the fact is those laws are on the books, and until those laws are wiped off the books, we have to have a system in place to do this. I'm proud that Canada and the CBSA is where it is with respect to how we undertake, or I can't say we anymore. I don't, how the agency undertakes that responsibility.
Yeah. The burden on detention, or the onus to keep someone detained, I think is also higher here than in the United States, is the sense that I'm getting, at least in recent news.
Yeah.
And so then you go from there to the Chief of Enforcement and Intelligence Operations. And I got
Intelligence.
an email from someone earlier in the week saying, "Hey, Steve, my immigration file has been reported to the CBSA Enforcement and Intelligence Operations. What does that mean?" And I said, "Well, funnily enough." So maybe I said, "I'm not fully sure, but funnily enough, I'm going to be speaking to someone this week." So what is enforcement and intelligence operations?
Okay, I'll try and make this as not boring as possible. The
Doesn't sound
CBSA,
boring, but yeah, okay.
the CBSA is a massive 15,000 plus
Yeah.
employees organization. It's huge, right? Everyone is probably more familiar with the frontline uniform responsibilities, and a lot less familiar with some of our back end plainclothes responsibilities. So much like a police agency has their frontline patrol officers who go out in the marked police vehicles and uniforms to go out and do marked police work. That's kind of the CBSA's frontline port of entry, workforce, right?
Yeah.
There is also an investigative function, and the investigative functions fall under the enforcement and intelligence components of the agency. They move pieces around and change names from time to time, but the gist of it is you have criminal investigations,
Yeah.
which is just as it sounds. Some really talented and fantastic investigators that undertake really complicated investigations, from criminal investigations of border legislation, ranging from gun running to human smuggling to immigration fraud.
Including amongst consultants, there have been some big
Including
ones
amongst
in
consultants, exactly
BC.
right.
Yeah.
There was a Project Nucan that got tremendous amount of airplay at the time. This is a number of years ago now, and it was exactly that. It was immigration fraud being perpetrated by immigration consultants, not specifically the individuals making application for different status.
Yeah.
So, and then there's the intelligence operations, which is where I was. And then of course there's the inland enforcement operations, which we've talked at length about. I can't speak obviously to any case specifics. I don't have the keys to the kingdom anymore, but if someone's immigration file has been referred to CBSA's intelligence and enforcement arm, it's likely that there's been some anomalies identified by whomever was initially processing the file, oftentimes IRCC, pardon me. And so now the CBSA is taking a look at it from an investigative standpoint. My role in intelligence range. So intelligence is everything short of evidence. So intelligence is information that's collected, analyzed, moved through a formal analytical process to produce everything from assessments to targets to profiles to you name it, to point the pointy end of the spear towards areas where it needs to be looking.
Yeah.
And that's a big body of work. I was fortunate in my 8-ish years there to undertake that work and lead teams undertaking that work on both sides of the house, the immigration and the customs side of the house. I preferred the customs side of the house because it was all drug smuggling focused for the most part. And it goes back to what I was saying before. It's sort of like targeting people for doing versus being. but there's also some threat actors, well, a lot of threat actors operating in the immigration space that, and a lot of overlap too, right? So that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, Sam Cooper's done a fair amount of work on the overlap.
Yep.
Local
Yes,
journal.
he's a fantastic read, by the way. If
Yeah,
you
we had
haven't
him on the podcast probably about 6-7 months ago, maybe.
if you haven't read Willful Blindness, highly recommend.
Mhm.
It's a real eye opener into the murky web of immigration, organized crime, government influence, and the whole shebang. He's done a tremendous job with that work.
No, we had him on. It was interesting because it did generate a bit of pushback, but we had him on because some people ask, well, why are Chinese people being disproportionately sent for comprehensive background checks? And I basically said, well, we have to have Sam Cooper on to like provide the explanation, because regardless of and we can get to this, how it's being done, there are legitimate concerns there. Did your office do like comprehensive background checks? That's probably the big topic, and one of the big topics anyways in immigration today, are the huge increase in the number of applications requiring comprehensive background checks.
So no, the way yes and no. The way the agency operates, so with respect to immigration applications, kind of writ large, all of that deep dive screening is done by a unit in Ottawa at the national level. Occasionally, regional intelligence assets will be asked to support that in various ways, but ultimately the screening itself takes place in Ottawa, in the Ottawa-based unit. Where regional intelligence will find itself operating is more in the space of working to understand more about specific groups or individuals who are suspected to be threat actors operating in the region, and in the process producing intelligence to support enforcement opportunities to disrupt their actions and activities.
So would that be like, again, in the Chinese context and sort of related to Sam Cooper's appearance, there's big concerns, and I think the federal court has upheld that anyone who's a member of the United Front is inadmissible to Canada, and they seem to have dozens of affiliate organizations, possibly in British Columbia. Would it involve researching orgs like that so that the agency kind of gets an understanding as to which organizations may be of interest?
To some degree, yes.
Yeah.
The work that my teams did in that space was very specific to how to put this, individuals who were either tangentially or on occasion directly linked to organizations like the UFWD that were engaged in largely drug smuggling, specifically precursor chemicals, the movement of precursor chemicals into Canada from China in particular. And it's in the space of that work that we would uncover linkages that pointed towards that sort of organization.
Yeah, that sounds so. And I think one of the big questions, and I guess this doesn't pertain directly to your role, but maybe it, like the distinction between what CSIS does and what CBSA does in these spheres.
Yeah, so the service, God bless them. They CSIS, their job is with respect to the enforcement of the Immigration Act or the Immigration Act or IRPA generally, is to contribute information that supports decision makers in which way they go on any particular application or decision to arrest or report or whatever, right? The challenge with CSIS is their information, their intelligence is not evidence, and the sources from which their intelligence is derived are often not sourceable.
Mm-hmm.
And so the value of the information that they supply to the CBSA, while informative, is not always useful. Whereas the intelligence that the CBSA produces, because it's all in-house and we understand the needs of the inland enforcement component of our of the business, is in a position where we can at times generate intelligence that can be converted to evidentiary use, and it's more usable and useful.
Why is CSIS involved then? Because like I've seen a few CSIS reports and I've thought, I don't understand. Like I feel like CBSA would have this, especially some of the people in Vancouver who are like, there's some incredible officers with really thorough knowledge of these different organizations here.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never, why does it have to go to CSIS when, I guess, as you said, like the CBSA has the actionable evidence?
Well, because there's an agreement in place between the organizations, and they hold a certain amount of responsibility for national security. Mm-hmm. So they also have access to sources that the CBSA does not. Yeah. They generate and collect information in ways the CBSA cannot, and so, you know, I think it's for those reasons that CSIS has a stake in it. But it's you know, the CBSA faces the same quagmire with CSIS as the RCMP do. Mm-hmm. In terms of the usefulness and usability of the information, right? Like, so it's kind of a catch-22. If you don't have them there, then you're limiting yourself in terms of the sources of information that could help with decision making. But by the same token, that information that you receive from them, because the sources can't be directly attributable, is less useful to you than it would otherwise be. So it's I don't know, it's a bit of a sticky wicket. I think, in my view anyway, I think the government would do well to further empower and enable the CBSA to be more effective in its mandate and in its functions. And the governments successively, I'm not calling it any political stripe here, I'm saying governments successively, whether it's liberal or conservative, have historically taken the view, seemingly, that you know, whatever needs to be done that isn't being done outside of existing mandates can be done better by the RCMP or done better by CSIS, which is frustrating when you're not a member of either of those organizations. Mm-hmm. Because they tend to then command the funding that goes along with, you know, those additional responsibilities in lieu of the CBSA itself. And, you know, I mean, a perfect example, Stephen, would be, you know, a border patrol. We have the RCMP that's funded to do patrolling between ports of entry, whereas the CBSA is the country's national border agency. You know, why does it make sense to fund the RCMP versus fund and train and equip the CBSA to carry out the full range of border mandate responsibilities, and then allow the RCMP to really streamline their focus into their core federal policing responsibilities and that sort of thing? So it becomes I think it becomes a financial and sort of ego-driven bun fight at the most senior levels, and I'm talking about like deputy minister, commissioner, and president sort of levels. And I think the RCMP and CSIS are agencies that have pre-existed the CBSA, despite the fact that Customs is actually the senior service in the country and predates the creation of the RCMP. But nevertheless, the RCMP and CSIS are more well established, more well entrenched, and bolder about what they're prepared to lobby and argue for than the CBSA is. And the CBSA's leadership, in my view, has suffered greatly from the political appointees the government puts into those senior postings, because for the most part, none of them have ever done any frontline operational work in any meaningful way ever for any organization.
Yeah. A couple other questions. I want to be clear. It's your view. You're not here representing CBSA.
Nope.
When it comes to security screening, like the federal court at the start of 2024 kind of expanded the definition of espionage to include anyone who may in the future return to their country of citizenship, including under coercion, and divulge information. And this appears to have led to a huge explosion in background checks, investigations into Chinese citizens. And at the operational level, like how do you screen for that? Like, how does one, the CBSA officer looking in, like in theory, it could be any Chinese person. But how at the actual, like, how would that be operationalized when such a sweeping court decision comes down? The individual people doing the background check, I imagine, must get, here's the court decision, and they go, what is it that I'm looking for? Like, what actually dictates what you mentioned before? Like, there's people who haven't done frontline. As far as I know, politicians have been completely silent on it. How does what you screen for kind of get created? Like the actual policies or guidance on what individuals doing these investigations are looking for?
So I can't really speak to that, Stephen, honestly, because I wasn't a policy guy. I've only ever been immersed in the operational side of things, so I'm on the receiving end of whatever the policy is. And my teams have been on the receiving end of whatever the policy is. So I can't speak to how the policies themselves are developed or written.
Yeah. Do you think, just in the general sense, like I was chatting with an immigration lawyer the other day who was talking about how frustrating the long background checks are. And I said, well, other than a massive tax increase, it seems like the only ways, like Canada, maybe I'm being too negative. Canada seems to have three choices. Either we just let people in because it's really hard to screen for, or we become overly restrictive, especially in the context of say Iran and China, or we have to become like a huge surveillance state, which you sort of have seen in some recent legislation. Do you think that's too negative on my part in terms of the limitations on security screening and investigations?
I don't know. I don't know if that's too negative. I think the likelihood that that Canada will ever find itself, well, I may never say never, but the likelihood that Canada will ever find itself moving towards option 3, I think, is extremely low. That costs a lot of money, for one. And 2, I think Canadians, generally speaking, are much less tolerant of government intrusion and monitoring in their lives than perhaps citizens in other nations around the world. So that leaves the 2, and politically keeping everyone out of Canada, like closing the doors, is I mean, let's be honest. That a Liberal government in particular took steps to curtail immigration to Canada, I think is eye-opening. But it was only in the face of pressure from the public around largely housing affordability.
Yeah.
So, the public isn't terribly concerned about border security. They haven't been, for the most part, unless, it interferes with, you
Standard
know,
of living.
their standard of living, and or how long they had to wait at the border coming home,
Mhm.
right? Or how much they were taxed for whatever purchases they made wherever they were returning from. That's sort of the extent of the Canadian pulse on border security. And so, you're stuck. So you're between. Well, do we let everyone in? Well, that's not politically palatable either, because then you end up with circumstances where politicians are being held to account for things government agencies didn't do. And you can't freeze everybody out, because we're a nation that can only grow economically with immigration. So there's a delicate balance between those two, and I think until such time as Canadians are faced with, another sort of 9/11 level event, I don't think border security is really on the radar. I think, though, with what's going on in the United States, it will start to increase more.
In terms of people
And
coming up, or in
I
terms of
think so.
pressure
I
to
think so.
copy the Americans, or
Yeah, I think so. Um, I think at some point over the next, 3 years, I think the way the way the winds are blowing, there's every likelihood that we're going to start to see Americans asking for Canada's protection from their own government. That may be an unpopular view amongst some listeners, or other listeners are probably going, "Yeah, you're absolutely right." It's just my view,
yeah.
based
No, we
on
had Jason Kenney on the podcast, and he said the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's, what's going on down in the United States. I think is going to put border security at the forefront for
Mhm.
Canadians in a way that it really hasn't been, certainly since 9/11. I mean, the nicest thing I've ever heard from a member of the Canadian public was in the days following 9/11, when air travel had resumed, and you know, it was still very acutely on the minds of the traveling public in particular. And I had an individual arrive at my primary inspection booth at YVR, went through sort of the perfunctory questions, and determined, there was no risk there, and released him. And he stopped, turned around, came back, stood right in front of me, and said, "Thank you for keeping us safe."
Mhm.
And that's ultimately what CBSA officers do on a day in
Mhm.
and day out basis. And it's something that's largely forgotten by the Canadian public until something of that level reminds them of the importance of that role.
Yeah, definitely. I think last question is one prompted by a live question, which just talks about transparency, and I want to spin that into sort of um, you talked about whether CBSA properly advocates for itself. In the last couple of weeks, we like the Edmonton police kind of came out pretty forcefully against what Crown were doing with regards to a sentence in a vicious murder there, and I think the Toronto police on social media have been tweeting at politicians, which has led some people to say, stay in your lane,
Mhm.
and other people to say, well, no, these organizations should be saying how they feel, and just because you're in public service or a Teams member doesn't mean either that the organization or the individual shouldn't be bringing awareness to things. What are your thoughts on that? Like, should some of these organizations, especially that might be not kind of, well, just what are your thoughts on these organizations either advocating for themselves in public or for the policies that they believe are beneficial in public?
I think you have to draw a distinction between what agencies are advocating in that way versus what ones aren't. Police agencies in Canada uh, are well established as being independent from political influence or interference. And when a police department, uh, at its chief constable level, makes a decision to communicate in that way for the best interests of their department, it is a massive morale boost for its membership, and very widely popular move on the part of those departments. It's something that I wished my own agency had done in the wake of any number of circumstances, ranging from the death of Lucia and the protests and the way the CBSA was being dragged through, because officers feel that, right? They feel officers of any organization attach themselves to that organization. It becomes a part of their identity. And when their organization is being dragged through the mud, they feel that. And so when a police agency speaks out against issues that are impacting their officers' morale, it's widely supported by the rank and file, and police agencies, I think, are uniquely able to do that. Whereas an organization like the CBSA is heavily politically influenced, and it's led by people who are terrified of biting the hand that feeds them. So that's been a struggle for CBSA officers for as long as I've been a part of that organization. They would love nothing more than for their own agency to turn around and say, hey, wait a minute, our men and women are doing a really tough job, and they're doing the best they can with the laws that are on the books. You got a problem with it, go bang on the politician's door. The challenge there, though, is the CBSA is a part of the federal public service, and the federal public service has a responsibility to remain nonpartisan, and that's why you end up with the no comment kind of responses, I think, largely, but also a bit because we have the agency has suffered from leaders that are more interested in serving themselves than the people they lead.
And at the political level, the current minister is likely on a very, very, very short leash after. It was very, it was, flooring to watch him. I guess it was leaked. He didn't intend it, but blasting a law that he's introducing, which then has to be enforced by people who, from what I can tell, as I'm talking about the gun buyback, aren't thrilled about it at all. Actual last question. This time I promise, because for going back to your podcast, for people who are listening who want to check it out, and who probably are coming at it from an interest in immigration primarily, but which episodes would you recommend? I'll recommend the Calvin Krusty, David Lag-Lyons. Are there any other episodes that you'd recommend on your podcast that
sort of specifically from
not necessarily immigration, but just ones that you're if you want an intro to your podcast, bearing in mind that our audience is primarily it's a range of people in immigration, profs, judges, lawyers.
Yeah, I think I think you touched on the Calvin Krusty episode. I think Scott McGregor is another episode that's worth listening to. Scott has a deep intelligence background and a wealth of knowledge in the same sort of space that Sam Cooper has been reporting in. I think that's absolutely worth your while if you're interested in just a bit of a behind the scenes look from a very human perspective of being a CBSA officer. The Dave Langland's episode is excellent for that. And just generally, if you want to listen to, an episode of what that struggle is like for someone undertaking those kinds of duties, whether it's a CBSA officer, police officer, firefighter, or paramedic, any number of them will give you a window into that.
Awesome, Christian.
And you can find us. I should say, I'm going to plug here. You can find the show on all the podcast platforms. It's called the Team 10-8 Podcast. iTunes, Spotify, everywhere you will find podcasts. We're also at team108.com. You can find us on the socials at team10_8 on Instagram, Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn personally. as well as the Team 10-8 podcast on LinkedIn. And I'm also now retired, working as a mortgage broker. So you can find me at Laneway Mortgages.
Yeah, no, it's a great, we'll for sure link to it in the show notes. It's Team 10-8, each individual words, although it's one word when you go to the website, but yeah. When you type in the HTML. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on, Steve. It's great to see you again.
Yeah.